Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Our in-depth study of Acts moves now into chapter 14. Today's lesson will be the halfway point in this book. And this is lesson 36, so we still got a long way to go. In our last lesson, Paul and Barnabas had moved their ministry that's still both to the Jews and now to the Gentiles, onto the mainland of Asia Minor, and to what would be Turkey today. Excuse me. This region was the most important Roman colony in Asia Minor at the time, so the church is not only in Gentile country, but where there is more significant Roman rule, and presumably, one would assume, less Jewish rule and influence. But as we will see at the start of today's reading, Luke reports that the Jews here are also against the Christians, or against the Christian movement, and have influence with the Gentile leadership there, and have social status in this community. They caused the Christian ministers to be persecuted and driven out of the town that we talked about last week, and the town they're going to move to during today's lesson. They travel on the mainland to Iconium, which is about 90 miles southeast of where most of the story was set last week, which is in Antioch of Poseidon on the mainland. So let's read, starting at the end of chapter 13 in verse 49, and we'll read through the first 7 verses of chapter 14. We'll be reading in the New Revised Standard Version. Thus the word of the Lord spread throughout the region. But the Jews incited the devout women of high standing and the leading men of the city, and stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas, and drove them out of this region. So they shook the dust off their feet in protest against them, and went to Iconium. And the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. The same thing occurred in Iconium, where Paul and Barnabas went into the Jewish synagogue excuse me, and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks became believers. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who testified to the word of his grace, and granted signs and wonders to be done through them. But the residents of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, and some with the apostles. And when an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, the apostles learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Iconium, and to the surrounding country, and where they continued proclaiming the good news. As we see here, closing out the end of the Poseidon Antioch mission that was the subject last week, they went into the Jewish synagogue now that they've been driven out of Iconium out of Poseidon Antioch to Iconium, and they follow that same plan in that they go to the Jewish synagogue first to preach. And both Jews and Gentiles, a certain number of them, accepted this new teaching, this new belief, and they became believers. Iconium was located at a major intersection of multiple roads that crossed there, note scholars, It was a major commercial and political center at that time of this area of the Roman Empire. The Romans had superimposed a Roman identity on these Greek people, which really are uh, Phrygians also and Armenians. So you have a mixed culture of these people here over many, many centuries, people moving back and forth along this route. And so they were referred to as Greeks here, but although they adopted Greek culture for the most part, they still maintain a major part of their uh, ethnic background culture. These people had their own well-established pagan religion and worship it, and they had an indigenous god of their own called Cybele. Cybele, I think is maybe the better pronunciation, and that they called that god Mother. And a later version of that goddess in the Roman culture that became there was Odysseus. By Paul's time, Greek and Roman gods were also recognized for for important political reasons. In other words, when Rome came in, they very quickly recognized the importance of lining parallel with the gods of the people, whatever gods they had there. They realized that if you understand religion or support the religion, you have an easier time ruling them. These people had accepted enough Greek and Roman culture to hold dual citizenship, have an influence. The people that were there had influence at some fairly high levels of society, and influence at the Roman ruling society as well. Archaeologists say that evidence has not been found to support, though, that Jewish influence or even a Jewish synagogue was present in 1st century AD here. But it doesn't mean it wasn't there, they just haven't found it. But many scholars suggest there likely was some Jewish community present, considering the dominance of the commercial, or how well this community dominated commerce. These Jews here appeared focused not to allow their Jewish community to become contaminated by the Christian Jewish sect, note many scholars. So scholars also note that Luke does not refer to these Greeks here that are hearing Paul and Barnabas as proselytes or God-fearing. So their involvement, scholars say, with Judaism, that is the local population's acceptance of Judaism, doesn't appear to be at near the level we've seen elsewhere where they've been brought. In other words, they're not necessarily there beginning to adopt Judaism. They tend to still have their own religion, but have social connections with the Jews. These scholars make the point that many were converted, that is, both Jews and Greeks, or these people that lived there, were converted. They accepted the new teaching. But other Jews are unconvinced by the Christian preachers, says Dr. Holliday of Emory University. The opposition to Christian theology seems have been very different, though, from that placed in Luke's previous reference to Judaism having trouble with Christianity, because they use the word here, poisoning the mind or soul of the Gentiles, depending on your translation. So there's something there, we don't know what, over and above what we've seen in this persecution or in the teaching to keep the local population from adopting Christianity. Several scholars have marked that this new church is united with, as far as its believers that come in, whether they be Jew or whether they be Greek/Gentile, they seem to be united. And those who are against them seem to be united. So it's a strong dichotomy. Dr. Eugene Boring at Texas Christian University, or emeritus from there, also a known disciples minister, notes that some Jews and Gentiles believed and joined the movement, but others opposed from both sides. That is, both Greeks and Jews opposed. Relative to the Jews, he says, it is important for us to understand what it is that they are not accepting or that they're not believing. All the Jews are still believers in the one God, he said. So we're not talking about them not believing because of what they believe about God. Instead, and that is, they still believe the God that's described in the scroll, the God of Judaism. What they do not believe or do not accept is the Christian message or gospel, he says. He notes it is not Judaism as a religion or Jews as an ethnic group that are the problem in Acts, although he says there are many people who don't catch this. He said it's the lack of belief. They're not believing the new message. They're not accepting the new message. They're not changing their paradigm. He adds the dividing line is not race, it's not ethnic, it's not national, it's not cultural, as some have assumed, but unbelief that God has already sent the Messiah, Jesus as the Christ. The core issues are, has the Messiah come, and is salvation now routed through that Messiah? Some scholars address the poisoning of the mind with this reminder. Christians that grow up in the same denomination and congregation that they are in as adults now, so often miss how significant the mind is versus habit in their election or making religious decisions. The battle wages here, notes Dr. Robert Wall in his commentary, is for the mind. For the Gentile, it is overcoming their ignorance of Christian teachings in general. So what is it that the Jew is opposing or doing to prevent these Gentiles from accepting the gospel? Acts does not tell us that. Doesn't even hint at it, he says. But it seems to be why Paul and Barnabas elect to stay on for a while, because they tend to think they can convince, or that the Holy Spirit will do something to help change these people's mind. But what happens, of course, according to Luke's storyline here, is the level of tension escalates, both to include insults towards these people, towards Paul and Barnabas, as well as physical violence towards them. That is, stoning. They're casting stones at them, and this causes Barnabas and Paul to flee in the area towards the southwardly anyway, to the safety of Lystra and Derbe, which are still in the same major province, but they're further out in the countryside, following one or the other of those routes that came into this town. Scholars for decades have rejected or have reacted to Luke's referring here to Paul and Barnabas as apostles, since his writings up to this point reflect that neither would meet qualifications of an apostle. That the early The early church tended to only use the term apostle for the original 12. There is some evidence that in Syrian Antioch, though, from which Paul and Barnabas were sent, that church, which you might be what we said was kind of now the new headquarters for the Gentile ministry, they had sent these people out and referred to Paul and Barnabas, it appears, as apostles. That is, they sent them out, they commissioned them. But Luke, in the opening of chapter 13, remember, made it very clear that it was not man sending them out, it was the Holy Spirit. Some Bibles translate apostle here in what we read today with a small a, leaving the capital A only for the original 12. In the Greek text of these verses we read today in chapter 14, apostle appears with what appears to be would appear to be a small a only in verse 4, whereas the second use of the word there in verse 6 is also apostle in the Revised Standard. But instead, the Greek text does not have the word apostle there in verse 6. It has the pronoun for you, which is the way the NIV and some others translate it. The Greek word translated apostles here was a word in the Greek vocabulary before it was ever used here in the New Testament. So the word apostle is not a new word. It had a meaning in Greek before this. It simply meant, it was a secular word. It was not being used in religious words. So the writer here, Paul, and other writers are pulling this word essentially out of secular society and use it in a religious context. It simply meant a delegate or an authorized messenger of whoever sent you. The word apostle essentially had no meaning if it wasn't tied to the messenger, that is, who is sending me, the authority. So Paul and Barnabas here in today's reading are being referred to in this general use of the term, note several scholars. Rather than the 12 apostles, they're just being referred to with the little a, they have been sent out, and now who is it that's sending them out? Luke says the Holy Spirit, while there is secular evidence out there or other extra biblical sources that suggest it was the church in Antioch of Syria, where you might say they were considered apostles. Dr. William Willimon, in his commentary at this point, teaches that we modern readers need to always appreciate that Luke here in Acts is trying to make a theological point for a particular individual, for an individual Theophilus, that he go back there in the first volume of Luke, which is the Gospel of Luke, and we see that very clearly. That's to whom he is writing. He is not writing a travelogue of Paul's journeys for us modern day readers. Luke does seem to be trying to give Theophilus the idea that there has been both joy in seeing the spread of Christianity and the adoption of both Christianity within certain groups of Jews and in Gentiles, but that there also is much pain and rejection in this Christian movement as now that it's in Turkey. It's not just the Jews that are rejecting, the Gentiles are rejecting too, maybe stirred up by the Jews and maybe on their own accord. So he says a point can be made: Christianity has been under a constant threat of extinction all along, but the gospel and the movement are still present and gaining ground. It's kind of the way he summarizes the situation here. Luke is clearly placing the bulk of the resistance here, though, he says, on the Jews. And other scholars, majority of scholars I found anyway, support that. Paul and Barnabas have had evangelical success in Iconium after having been kicked out from north of there in Antioch of Pisidia. It is their success that is causing the problem. Or is it their theology? Or is it their approach? No, most of those would be some pretty good ideas for discussion. Or maybe we should add, is there a political problem here as well? That political objections. We don't have much to go on here, but scholars say this is put here to, rather than answer questions, to kind of give you something to ask some questions, or giving Theophilus, to whom he's writing, so just enough information to cause him to be asking some greater questions. Hope this gives you some idea how some of the lead scholars look at this text that we read, and that you have a good Bible study, and we'll see you next round.